Okay, for chapter 3, I want to start with the chart on page 89 because I think this is a really good chart. So in this chapter, what the court is laying out and arguing for are 5 different audience formations. So there's affective, accumulative, assembling, listening, and agnostic. And she's really clear at the end that the lines between these are blurry. Our goal, as contributing members, is not to create a specific kind of public. That's never going to work. Our goal as rhetorical analysts is not to identify this is 100% a listening community. Done. I labeled it. Life is great, grand. All the world's problems are solved. That's not the goal either. What she's doing is labeling these audience formations so that we can better understand as rhetorical actors what audiences, how audiences form to support empowered action, and then what those actions look like based on some of those formations. It's essentially, here are patterns in audience formation and how they impact some of the communication, some of the discourse, some of the learning, some of the assumptions that audience members are supposed to have. To a huge extent, this is just like the rhetorical handbooks that we were reading about. So the Rhetorica ad Herennium that we read about as kind of one of the first and the most well-known handbooks of the time laid out, here are the things you need to know about rhetoric, right? That's what she's doing here. Here are how rhetorical practices operate to lead to the formation of audiences within publics, and then some of the functions of the audiences. So when you read this section and when you go through it and when you're answering the notes, I really do ask for high level understanding of what is the function of each of these, because knowing the nuances of them will only be helpful if you're using that as the frame of analysis. But the goal is to understand, here are 5 different formations and the practices that are connected to each of them that can be different, and the functions and even some of the ideas that are circulating within that public that are different because of the audience formation and how they support it. None of these are going to be the same. There is not one model, but we can at least start with, here are 5 broadish categories of audience formations, the relations that are created within them, how those relations, because she goes on to talk about it, are both affective and influencing or impacted by the rhetorical practices that are supported or used. And then she talks about how that leads to a potential outcome, because again, the Habermasian public needs this outcome at the end, needs this social action. And so here's some potential social actions, because it's kind of, it's like an equation, A plus B equals C. The public sphere activity plus the relations created equal the potential outcome. And they can mix and match, but they really won't. Like a listening public, she talks about here, relations created of understanding and accountability. Understanding and accountability can lead to solidarity, which is listed as a potential outcome under affective. But solidarity is usually indicated through action. So, unions are huge in PA, and we see unions stand up in solidarity with other unions. When you stand up in solidarity, or when you literally sign an email in solidarity, that is an action, which is not rhetorical listening. Those are 2 different things. So it seems like some of these potential outcomes could be mixed and matched, and they potentially could, and or one audience can exist simultaneously in a couple different categories. Okay, so again, that's why you're not going to be epically quizzed on these 5 audiences. That is not the goal of this chapter. That is not her purpose for this chapter, and she's trying to make that really clear. Instead, it's to see these 5 different formations and what kinds of relations they create, and how that naming and the relations they create lead to kind of restricted outcomes because of the formation of the public, and that's driving the rhetorical practices that are valued within that space. Okay, so she goes through them then. So obviously read through the examples, because those are really helpful. But a couple of the things that I need you to note, I made little notes to myself on my ice cream cone here. Yay, summer. Some of the work of these audiences cannot be externally measured. And that's really difficult then to pull examples into all of this, right? Because how can you say this is a listening and this is an affective if it's really difficult from the outside to measure or to gauge? But that also means, connected to that idea, that internally, individual members don't necessarily recognize that's the type of audience they're existing as. Those are the types of rhetorical practices they're engaging, which means they're that type, which means these are the limitations to an extent on the outcomes that are possible because of the way that their community formed. They work through all of that, and they experience all of that, but they can't necessarily name it all. And that's not her goal here either. Her goal, again, is just these exist in real life, which means we're going back to the chapter 2 outcomes, because this is her outcome throughout. Rhetorical theory development is always alongside rhetorical pedagogy development. And so she's like, if I can see and name these audiences, I can provide language to students so that they can experience them, so that they as individuals can experience a shift in how they view and approach the internet. That is her ultimate rhetorical pedagogy goal. So these are being named only so that she can help students work through it, only so she can help students analyze, with the caveats that participants don't necessarily know unless they're students of this kind of stuff. And some of the external measurements of it are very difficult to find and very difficult to quantify for anything beyond a qualitative analysis. So she really wants to say, here are the kinds of work that are possible by digital publics, which leaves room for things to change. So I know some of your questions have been, this was published recently, but obviously written and put into press around the time that Musk was taking over Twitter. So with those changes, how does this adapt? She already left that open to us. And she does that towards the end of the chapter. So I'm on 120 to 121 when I made these particular notes of how things were changing. The categories are the kinds of work that are possible based on the examples that she included as a jumping off point for readers to then go and find new, to go and make changes, to go and talk about how changes in, like how companies are structured, because Meta and Facebook have restructured, how those can impact, sorry, I got stampeding cats through here, how those can impact the kinds of work that are possible by these audiences. None of these are fixed categories, they're all changeable. Okay, and then finally, towards the end of the chapter, on page 121, because again, I'm not going to go through all 5 of the audiences. You don't need to know the nitty-gritty. You need to know the kinds of work that are possible. She does a lot of that with the chart. The rest of it is just for bonus understanding, honestly. So she talks about, on page 121, she focuses on the idea that the affective is community material, which is an oversimplification, because she really wants to get at the idea that when we write, we're not creating a product, we're creating audience relations. This is her goal for the learning of her students. And it took me finishing the entire book and then coming back to this, because I highlighted it and I put like a little note to myself where I'm like, I teach a web writing class and there's something here that I want to use to change my pedagogical approach in my class. But I got to the end of the book and then I was like, oh, what she's getting at here, when we look at web writing, when we look at writing on the internet, we have a tendency to look at it as a product. But, and I think a part of this is attached to the changes that we have with information circulation, so chapter 1 and chapter 2 leading up to this chapter 3, we look at a lot of writing as a product, right? I have to complete an essay, and that essay is going to be graded, and I put in this time and energy, and I need to be rewarded for my time and energy, none of which are quantifiable based on the product that I have submitted. And so then there's this disconnect between grades and this thing that I've created, this tangibility. And so there's really, once we get to the end of this whole audience discussion and the changes that are possible for people as actors within these publics to become agents within these publics, they need to shift their understanding to, like, every time I communicate and I engage, I am not creating a product, I'm creating an engagement. I'm negotiating, my word, not hers, I'm negotiating a new relationship to the rest of the audience members, but not just the audience members, to the ecology. And that's the bigger piece that she's trying to get at. So again, constellation of theories, if we do it in relation to the ecology, then I'm putting my relationship, myself, my identity, my writing, my skills, my rhetorical practices into the mix, not as a product, but I'm putting them into the mix to become involved in this ecology, and stuff's going to happen to them when I'm not actively there. So if I post a picture, something's going to happen to it when I'm not actively on Instagram, when I'm not actively looking at all of this, because it has a circulation within the ecology that's beyond me. You can see my cat's tails now. They're very interested in this video. Post pictures of my cats, and then I go to bed. Stuff happens because I still have family on the West Coast. I'm on East Coast time, they're on West Coast time. Very different times right now. It's 3 hours different. A lot of stuff is happening after I have already gone to bed because of the time difference. Like, this ecology lives on. I'm not looking at this as a product. It is co-negotiating with the audience. I know it's not a great example of a public because she would not consider my Instagram feed a public, but it's one because they're right here that makes a lot of sense for me right now in this video. So I want you to take away from this, and like what she's getting at the end, again, she doesn't expect you to take away all of the nuances of all 5 of these audiences. Not her goal with this chapter. Her goal is, here's a demonstration of 5 audiences that I can name. The purpose of naming them is to help you understand some of the different formations that happen, how the rhetorical practices are influencing that, and how they sit and exist as part of a larger ecology. And that framing all together, including with the larger ecology, can help us as educators or as public citizens shift our orientation towards publics and the ecology of the internet as an embodied practice, so that we can then also understand, how does that impact me in real life? How do I take that to other places? How do I have a different starting point when I join a new public? Or how do I have a new starting point when I engage a new conversation? And I see that as engagement and as orientation, not as product creation. That's what she's getting at with the audiences. Okay, so don't spend a ton of time like, here are all of the things I need to know about each of these 5. What you really want to focus on is how they form, how you're understanding the practices, just to make sure you're understanding her use of rhetorical practices throughout this, how outcomes are associated with those rhetorical practices, so that she can get at centering. Like, the center of her observation is to shift student orientation, not to create better products. Let me know if you have any questions.